class of painting the rider, giving the rider his underpaint so he can be painted up to glow and go to war, go to chasing after Frankenstein's monster and all that good stuff. Maybe that's what I'll do. Maybe from now on I'll paint Frankenstein's monster for this class so we can have the riders chasing the monster, all with the flaming glow. All right, so getting on with the class in the usual pattern. So I'm going to try to cut it from 7 minutes down to 5. We'll try to cut the intro a little bit, but we're going to do the intro again. Right off the bat, I'm going to remind everybody that we have Katie here, who's going to be our moderator again. She's been putting up with me all day. Very patient, much appreciated. And so if you have questions, please make sure you put them in the Q&A section so that Katie can find them more easily, and she'll jump in and ask me the questions as we go. I'll emphasize this is meant to be a beginner class, so if you have questions, please ask. I'll probably put the answer in the context of what we're doing, but it's intended that you should be able to ask. The last convention when I did this class was about 90 minutes. We've made it 2 hours, specifically so that people that are beginning can ask questions, get the foundation stuff that they need to be, more successful going on their painting journey. All right, so a little bit about me. My name is Geoff Davis. I'm going to be teaching this class on underpainting approach to object source lighting. As usual, I'm going to say a big thank you to Reaper for running this event. Still flabbergasted that this whole thing's being run for free. People participate for free. And yeah, I think it's fabulous. Their approach to supporting beginners. If you've been into my classes already, you know that, I really appreciate this. I think they do a fabulous job. And I really appreciate the support they've given me for the beginner classes that we run here in the painting studio all the time. So much appreciated. Part of what I do is I take classes every chance I get. There's no replacement for taking in-person classes. If you can't get them at these times, get them online. I spent really the first 30 plus years of my miniature painting without anybody to ask questions, without another group of painters to interact with, without videos to look for on YouTube. For me, when Dark Sword started putting out those DVDs, and I got the Hot Lead DVD first, and then I got the Marika Reimer DVD, that was like a world-changing thing for me, being able to actually watch those videos on the TV and learn from that. So take instruction when you can get it. And I subscribe to Miniature Monthly as a Patreon subscriber, and I take classes from them. They put out videos every month, and they are fabulous. I don't get paid to promote them, in case you're wondering, that's why I always talk about them, but they have made such a huge difference to me personally in my painting journey. 30 years of no help, and in the last, and then 8 years of watching videos, and in the last 3 years, because I've been doing this 41 years now, the last 3 years, I've learned 100 times more than I did in the previous 30, and a large part of it's due to the help I've gotten from people like Aaron Lovejoy. I take classes from all the time. I did a boot camp for a weekend with Matt DiPietro out in Seattle, and that was almost like a life-changing 2 days of painting. So, and Elizabeth Beckley as well. I've taken some of her classes, and in fact, one of the classes I took from her helped change the way I thought about how to do layering and those things, and that's really fabulous. So, really good. All right, a little bit about who I am. Like I said, I've been a hobbyist for many years. In fact, miniature painting was the one hobby I had that survived my career. And after I retired a few years ago, I made miniature painting my full-time event, my full-time gig. And in fact, it actually grew to the point where my insurance company at home said, this can't be a home-based business anymore. You're too risky. We're cutting your insurance unless you take that out of the house. So now here I am. I'm in a 700 square foot commercial space, which gets paid for from the painting classes, from the commission painting and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, like I said, so I sit here all day, painting commissions, teaching classes, and generally speaking, I try to pass on what I've learned to other people so they don't spend their first 31 years of painting spinning their wheels trying to figure out how to practice stuff. So that's what I'm all about. The company is called Hecatina Miniature Painting Studio. At the moment, it's kind of a one-person show. Over the summer, I had a couple of people working here. I have my daughter helping me out when we do conventions, that kind of thing. We have a team of people comes together. And the intent is to help other commissioned painters develop to become professional painters. And there's a very good art school here. There's a community college across the street that has an art program. There's a really good art college in Halifax, and we're trying to build a community. So check out my website, it's hecatina.ca, if you want to check it out. If you're interested in taking a class from me, that's the place to go. It's very easy to get connected with us, and we do online classes for people all the time, as well as teaching classes here in the studio. And we love drop-in visits. A lot of the local commission painters that say drop in here, they buy their miniatures here, and we love that. It's all good. So yeah, that's what we're all about. 8:06, I cut it down by 1 minute. There we go. And now we are ready to get into the concept of object source lighting and the underpainting approach to object source lighting. So what I'm going to do to start off is we're going to just talk a little bit about the aim of the class. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this. So step by step, we'll advance the slide so you can see what the current step we're working on is, which paint we're working with, and make it a little bit easier for you to follow along. I'm going to leave following the Zoom call now, go back over to my virtual camera to make it a bit easier to see what I'm doing. And once again, just say, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and Katie will break in on me in my nonstop chatter to let me know what your questions are. And she's also going to warn me when I drift off screen, which with this particular class happens quite a bit. So try to stay on screen. Okay, so I think the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to build the palette that we're going to use, and we'll put in the we'll do the palette first, and then I'm going to do a little bit of explanation about what underpainting is about, and a little bit about the concepts of object source lighting, and then we'll just get in to start slapping some paint on the miniatures. So what we're going to do is we're going to build the palette so that the paints that we're going to use are on the palette in the order that we're going to use them, to make it easier for people to follow along and know which paint I'm using and when. So we are going to start off with, and if you don't have the exact same colors, doesn't really matter. The key is to have your colors go from darkest to lightest across the top, and the colors you're going to use to do the glazing on of color, like the oranges for our torches, drop them down at the bottom, okay? So I'm going to start with the happy black and brown has been our darkest color we've been using throughout. And you're going to need a fair bit of this first color. We're going to paint half the miniature of this color. So you need a fair bit of that. And then we're going to proceed onwards. Next one is earth brown, 9029, earth brown. I feel like I'm bingo color. 9029, earth brown. 9030, leather brown is the next one. And just generally speaking, we're getting lighter as we go across the top. Tanned leather is the next one. What I kind of like about these ones, you can buy them in triads. You can buy the earth brown, tanned leather in one triad, and then the next three are also a single triad that you can get in a pack from Reaper. Blocked nozzle. There we go. That never happens, right? Odd, since I've been using that paint like every class all weekend, that they would dry up. Although it's really dry here today. My paint's been drying in the wet palette within about 45 minutes. I keep having to recharge the wet palette during the class. Sorry, I forgot to say what the colors were. Tan leather, and then amber gold, and then 9033 golden blonde, and this final one is going to be 9061 linen white. Okay, those are the colors we're throwing on there. And then down at the bottom, it's going to be we're going to start with marigold yellow, which is lighter. I realize we're putting the lighter one on the left. And then we're going to use, what is this? Fire orange 9006. Again, you don't have to have the exact same colors, but just keep in mind we're going to use them in a progression from darkest to lightest. And I have a terrible habit of interchanging the word brighter with lighter. And if I do that as we go, I apologize, I'm getting a little bit tired now after a long day, so I might make that mistake pretty frequently. But in terms of this technique, what we're trying to do is use low value dark paints and build up to high value light paints to get contrast to show what's light and what's dark. And the basic approach for this style of object source lighting is, and this is nothing new, right? This is a very old technique. It's been used in portrait painting for a long time. It's called grisaille, which basically is underpainting the shadows. And when you do it with brown paint, as we're going to do today, it's called brunet, which is, I'm probably saying that wrong, but it's brunet. It's painting the shadows with brown. So object source lighting, just as a general concept, is really trying to create an illusion. Okay, when we have this dude with his torch in his hand, he's going out looking for the monster to burn. There's no real light there. There's no LED in there. There's no, off-camera light shining on him to create that brighter area. Like when you take a photograph of this guy, there's no side light pointing at him. It's an illusion. So we need to do a variety of things to have our brain look at this miniature and fill in the details so that we believe that it's actually illuminated, that it's lit up by a light. And one of the challenges in that is, if you're doing a two-dimensional portrait, working on canvas, you can paint the light into the background. You can paint his shadow on the wall as cast by the torch. You can paint the wall, with bricks, but then paint it orange as well to show the light hitting it. But with a miniature like this, standing out in the open, you don't have those things. So we need to have those key things, like having a very bright light source, so white painted in the center of the torch, intense colors like the orange to show the glow. But then we need to use other tools to point towards the light so that the person observing the miniature has their eye redirected towards the light, and their brain subconsciously fills in the information that this is dark and it's pointing to that, and that by comparison is light. So the idea here is, as I get tired, I start to slide into a bit of an accent as well. So I apologize for that too. There's going to be a lot of Scottish accent tomorrow in the, or Nova Scotia version Scottish accent in the tartan class tomorrow. But the idea is we're going to paint dark shadows with brown, and those shadows point towards the light source. That's the general idea. Now, this is underpainting, and I realized during the class yesterday, based on the questions, that there was a key idea in this that I was not conveying clearly. So I've made a few changes in terms of what I'm about to show you. The idea is we're underpainting. So we paint really dark shadows, darker than we would normally expect to see on the miniature, and we're going to work up to really light, high value, almost pure white highlights. So they're super bright because we intend to paint something over top of this. And that's going to dull down those bright highlights. It's going to lighten up those shadows. But we keep in mind that all the paints that we're using, all these acrylic paints, they look opaque in the palette, but to a certain extent, they're all somewhat translucent. And if you paint a very thin layer of these paints, what's underneath shows through. It has a strong influence on what's above. So we paint with all these colors that are browns. They all have a certain amount of yellow and red in them already. How do you get brown? You mix red and green. Green is made up of blue and yellow. So all these paints have a relative proportion of red, blue, and yellow in them already, and a fairly strong amount of red and yellow. What does that mean? If they are underneath what we're painting, they are going to show through and influence what's above that with that red and yellow, which is orange. So we then go and glaze oranges on top of these colors. They are a really strong supportive foundation for these oranges, which means that we paint the figure, give it this foundation, paint over this with translucent colors, blue, red, green, whatever it is we want to paint our miniature. What's underneath shows through. And then we glaze our color on top of it, and it works additively with the shadows. So these oranges make these oranges look better when we glaze them on as color at the end. And if we've done our highlights and shadows properly, all the shadows are pointing at that light source, makes it burst out, and our brain goes, that's on fire. All right, that our brain believes it. So what does this look like in practice? So I've got some photographs now of miniatures that I've painted with this technique. So here, first of all, this is what we painted yesterday, right? This was a dude we painted yesterday. Okay, so we've got really bright highlights, a nice flamey torch on the go there. Okay, and if you forget about the color, just pretend that that was white. This would be the start point for painting this miniature, whatever colors you want to paint them. Okay. Some colors are going to work better than others. There's a color theory impact, but we're not going into that too far today. So what I'm going to show you is another miniature painted in that way. I'm going to show you this wizard. So here we go. This is Garwin Greywand, right? Classic Reaper miniature. And in fact, this is the miniature I used to use for teaching this object source lighting class before I started using the Rioter, because the Rioter's got fewer details. He's easier to paint quickly. But you can see on this pretty clearly, the color, the light direction is pretty obvious, right? The light source is here and the light is shining that way. And the shadows down here are, I think in this case, they're walnut brown, but they're really dark, almost, pretty much on the same order as this black and brown. So this miniature has been painted. This, in a sense, is a value sketch, right? We've got low values, dark down below, high values, bright up above, and the highest value is white in the center of what's going to be our light source, okay? So this is done first, and I probably only spend 10, 15 minutes doing this after I've primed the miniature, okay? I don't spend a lot of time on this. In fact, as I recall painting this one, I was going so quickly, I started throwing the light color. This was going to be a green glow before I remembered to take the photograph. So that's why there's a little bit of color there already. So after this was painted, here's what it looks like. So here's the finished miniature. We've got our white scroll here, right? We've got some green gems, got another green gem there. He's got normal skin tone. He's got a little gold trim on his robes here. He's got a red robe on. So there's lots of color on there, not just the browns, not the tans, and not just this lime green light color, okay? But you can pretty clearly see the influence of those really deep shadows underneath that. Like, look in there. If you just painted red, you're not going to have shadows nearly that deep, okay? So let's go back and compare that again to the one from before. There's the pre-painted shadows. This is the underpainting. And you'll notice that his face is pretty bright. That's because it's the focal point of the miniature. The face is always going to be a bit brighter than it should be to draw the eye in, to attract people to look at that, okay? That's why that is that way. Same with the face on the cat is brighter than it should be. Okay, so that's the underpaint. And then we paint over it normally with our smooth layers of paint. The shadows show through. And then in the end, we glaze on our color, and what's underneath supports that color. I believe in this case, I use Reaper Moth Green as the color I glazed on to be the light color. So that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed with our guy here. All right, so hopefully that puts it in a bit better context as to what we're doing and why and how it's going to work in the end. And now we're just going to bash on into the actual painting bit. Let's make sure I covered everything I was supposed to. Yeah, there's our dude. Okay, I didn't talk about this. I'm going to talk about this very briefly. I don't want to go too technical or too much physics or whatever, but the general idea to keep in mind is that we have our light source, and the further you get away from the light source, the more diffused it becomes. So the example they're showing here, they're saying that, at 1 meter distance, this square has 100% of the light. When we go out that same distance, another 1 meter, these 4 squares are being covered by the same light, which means that it's only 1/4 as intense. We go out another 1 meter of distance, and the light has fallen off even further. It's even more diffuse. So these 9 squares are illuminated by the same amount of light that was originally hitting this 1 square at 1 meter distance, making it 1/9 as bright. Go another step out, and these 16 squares are being illuminated by the same amount of light. This is the light fall off to the square rule or the inverse square law. And this means why do we care about this? Because this helps us tell our story. If we have the sun as our light source, and we're however many millions of miles away from the sun, the amount that the sun drops in intensity from the point where we're standing, say the front of the miniature to the back of the miniature, it's not going to become weaker at all. But if our light source is a flashlight or a lightsaber or a torch, a weak light source, then the intensity of that light is going to dissipate. It's going to fall off very quickly. And if we were to superimpose our miniature over this, it would be like concentric rings of progressively weaker light overlain on the miniature. So the light is intense, close to the light source, and the light source itself should be the brightest spot on the figure. And the further away you go, the weaker the light is going to get. But this is underpainting approach using dark browns. So instead of painting in the light source, we're going to go the other way. And we're going to start by painting in the darkest areas and then get progressively brighter the closer we go to the light source. So we're working in reverse, but it's the same core concept. All right, so here's our dude. Ready to go riot, ready to chase some monsters or cultists or whoever it is he's planning to string up. Maybe he is a cultist, I don't know. We'll know by the time we're done painting him, he's going to tell us his story. So I'm going to keep that up in the top right corner so you'll be able to see what step we're on. And if you zoom in really close on that, it also tells you right there in the corner what we're actually doing in this step, okay? All right, so what we're doing now is we're going to take our miniature and look at it, and we're going to decide which way is the light going. So we kind of rotate the figure, look around it. If we didn't have the light source on the figure, object source lighting, right? If we didn't have the object on the figure, right now we'd be choosing the overall light direction. Is it coming from down below? Is it coming from the sun? Is it a fire? Whatever it is, off the miniature. In this case, it's pretty easy. We have a point light source, which is the center of the torch. And the brightest point on that torch is going to be kind of pretty close to the bottom of that flame, above the kind of nub there, or the top part of that torch. So the brightest spot's going to be right in about there, okay? So we want to look at that and say, kind of, let's look at it from the perspective of, let's look through the torch at the figure. And that's the perspective I'm showing you on the screen right now. So that torch light is going to directly hit pretty much everything that we can see right now. It's going to be hit directly with the light. But the further away those surfaces are from the torch, the dimmer that light is going to be. So close, it's going to be quite bright. By the time it gets to the top of the head, it might be at 25%. One more distance away, by the time we get here, it's going to be at, so this would be 1/4, 1/9. And then by the time we get down to his knees down here, we'd be at 1/16 intensity of the torch light. So the light's going to fall off. So, but we're going to go the other way. We're going to add the shadow. So now we're going to look at him from the exact opposite direction. We're going to line up him and look at him from the perspective of through his body to the torch light. So nothing that we can see right now is going to be hit directly by the light from the torch. Now it might get hit by light hitting the ground and bouncing back up and hitting the underside of him and illuminating that way. We call that backlighting. But we're not thinking about that today. This is a beginner class. We're talking about fundamentals and core ideas. So we're not going to worry about bounce light, any of those kind of like diffuse lights in the shadows or any of those things. We're just going to keep it really basic. So everything we can see from this perspective is going to be our darkest black and brown. Okay. So normally what I do is I actually, especially if I've got a light source which is off the figure, I actually mark that on the base. I'll make a note and say, all right, I lined up his hand through his head to the torch. That's my perspective for shadow. Or I'll make a note and put a mark on the base, and my perspective is the torch through his head to his hand is the light perspective. And I mark right on the cork that I use how bright that light is going to be and what the angle is, to help me if I go away and I paint the thing and maybe come back a couple of days later to get me reoriented back onto what is my perspective. That helps me, work on the project in successive steps. Keeps me on track. Okay, that's the general idea. So we've done that. We know what our perspectives are. We know what's going to be really dark. We know what's going to be really light. And now we're going to go on to step 2, which everybody's favorite step, well, my favorite step for sure. And we are going to basically paint everything from the previous step that was in shadow. We're going to paint our darkest color, including the shadow areas on the base that would not be hit directly by the light. Okay, and I don't have that in the diagram up on the right corner, but that's what we're going to do. And generally speaking, we're going to be working in reverse in terms of our highlight intensity. So we're 100% dark for, let's say, half of the figure. And then we're going to be, so that would be our 1/16th illumination. We're going to be twice as bright by the time we get a little bit closer, and then twice as bright as that again when we go one step further up. So we're going to start by painting about half this guy, our darkest brown color. And there we go. I'm 1 for 6, and remembering to put my visor on at the start of classes. There we go. Got my eyes now. I can see what I'm doing. All right. And we're going to start slapping that brown paint on there. Now I need to find a bigger brush to make this go a little bit more efficiently. That brush is maybe a bit too beat up. Whatever. Oh, there's my brushes I'm looking for. Laying all off the side where I threw them earlier today. I got fed up with these while I was working on one of the earlier classes. Okay, there we go. And the brush that you use, generally speaking, doesn't really matter, okay? I'm using these Raphael 8404 size 0, which is pretty much one of the best brushes on the go out there right now. But these ones have been rather abused, and they're pretty beat up, okay? But it doesn't really matter what you're using. And we're not, again, this is beginner foundation stuff. We're not going to try to do a lot of really complex blending. We're not going to do wet blending. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to do simple layering and, you know, get the foundation in place for what's to come later in your painting journeys. So over to the wet palette we go. And my paint, as I said, it's really dry here right now. The paint is drying in the palette within about 45 minutes. So I am going to be adding just a little touch of water to my paint. But generally speaking, I don't. Not for something like this. I'm not trying to paint with really thin, like you hear them talk about, apply thin coats of skim milk consistency paint. That's not what I'm aiming for today. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm taking the paint out of my reservoir, placing it some of it down below, and then I'm kind of rolling and working the paint to smooth it out and load it into the brush. So I don't want the paint on the brush in a blob. I want the paint smooth and inside the brush so that it'll flow off the brush the way it's supposed to work, and I'll be able to control how thick it is. And you know, I hear Aaron Lovejoy say this in classes all the time, that we're going to take our unthinned paint and we're going to paint it thinly. Okay, that'll give us a nice smooth coat. And we want to make sure we keep it nice and thin. I don't mean thinned, I mean painted on thinly, so that it will dry fairly quickly, because we don't want to be waiting a lot of time for each layer to dry. So
we had a couple questions, by the way.
Okay, I'm just going to get started painting, and you go ahead and start asking me those questions. And I encourage everybody else to get started slapping that dark black and brown paint on there right away. Okay, go ahead, Katie.
Okay, so first, someone asked if you could point to the colors again.
Sure thing. We've got black and brown, earth brown, leather brown, tanned leather, amber gold, wrong. What have I missed? Black and brown, earth brown, leather brown, tanned leather, amber gold, golden blonde, and linen white. It doesn't matter if you don't have the exact same paints. Like if you're, say you were missing the one in the middle here, it's not going to be a showstopper. We could just say mix these two together to get a step in between and keep going. You don't have to have exactly the right ones. The key is to have a really dark brown, a really bright white, and something in between that you can work with. All right, next question, Katie.
What if you prime in a black or a dark brown as far as the shadows go?
This will not work if you've already painted your whole miniature dark, okay? Because if you've done a zenithal prime, for example, the zenithal prime, where you say you've painted it black and then sprayed it with gray and then white paint from a high angle, the size of those highlights is not the same as the proportion that we're going to be looking for in terms of intensity in our dark shadows and the brightness of the bright highlights. That's why in the PDF for this class, it says that you really need to have the class, the figure, start out painted white. And these guys, when I got them, were gray in the package, so I painted them white to start for the class. If you've already painted your miniature and it's got like zenithal prime or something like that on the go, it's just going to be a little bit confusing later on when you try to decide where the lights and darks should be, because the zenithal prime or zenithal highlight you've done is going to be trying to tell you something different. So if you start having challenges like that, that's where it's coming from. It's because the miniature was dark to start with. The other thing that you're not going to have is I'm basically not going to paint the white spot at the center of the torch. I'm going to leave that white. So I'm going to work up to that, and that's going to be my brightest spot. Everything else I'm going to paint is going to be darker. So if right now you've got dark paint on your torch, get some pure white or get that linen white and paint your whole torch that white color. So at the very least, when we get to that stage, you'll have a nice bright white spot in the torch. All right, keep going, Katie.
Oh, that was it.
Oh, that was it. All right. So you guys are going to be way ahead of me now because I talk with my hands. I don't know how to stop it. I can't paint and talk for some reason. I'm sure my wife could explain it because I am completely incapable of multitasking. We know this. Although I can chatter aimlessly and paint, I can't answer questions clearly and paint at the same time. And I'll just emphasize again that you do want to do the shadows, the really dark shadows on the base as well. If we don't do them on the base, your brain will pick up on that information and look at your illusion that you're trying to build with these shadows, and we'll have reasons to disbelieve. We'll get to make it saving throw against the illusion because it'll have a reason to disbelieve. So we don't want to give any chances for saving throws. Wow, I can't believe I just did that. I've been playing first edition. I started playing first edition D&D around 1980. So that might be why. Anyway. No names. No guilt. I admit nothing. It never happened. All right, nice big shadow on the base there. And you've probably noticed by now that I'm not being particularly careful. It's okay to be messy at this stage. The key is to try to make sure that you don't leave any large white spots, because when we get to the end of this process, they initially won't show up too much through the black and brown, but when we get to the end of the process, they will stick out like a sore thumb because they'll be as bright as the center of the torch, and we want to try to avoid that. Going to paint the side of his face because we know that even though that's quite close to the torch, the light's not going to hit that directly. Inside his collar, torchlight, there's going to be quite a strong shadow in there. The torchlight doesn't easily reach in there, so we're going to paint inside that quite dark. I'm going to use this dark color for that. The whole side of his body here away from the torch, we're going to paint that color. Even though the light might kind of come across it diagonally, we can make adjustments for that later, but for now, we're going dark, really dark. I think right down here, this foot is probably far enough away. It's almost going to be as dark as the shadows behind him. And actually, so for this one today, I decided a little while ago, I'm going to make it actually darker even than this one, which is already pretty dark by comparison to the one I did at during ReaperCon Live. So we're going to go pretty dark on this one, just to so we have some comparison to the other ones. All right, I'm going to keep painting. Oh, I just heard Dory sing in my ear, just keep painting, just keep painting. All right. Normally I have the music playing to keep from thinking, keep those disturbing thoughts about, Dory, just keep painting going in from my head. Keep it quiet. All right, now I'm going to do it on the other side. Yeah. This is probably the longest step. This takes quite a bit longer than the other ones, but it pays off in the end. This is probably why my nice Raphael brushes are pretty much toast. I'm not treating this brush very well. Painting sand on the base with it, and pushing the paint in all the little crevices here, working the paint to be smooth. Not very nice to the brush. But of course, that is the fate of all paintbrushes, is to apply paint and get worn out in time. I'm generally speaking, when the brush is new, I'm quite careful with it. I take good care of it. I'm going to clean them with brush soap on an appropriate interval, not all the time, but regularly. Clean all the dried acrylic out of them and that kind of thing. And generally speaking, they last pretty long. When I've got my Winsor Newton Series 7s here on the desk too, a whole bunch of them that are in various stages of ruin. But it's interesting that I find that the older ones have lasted longer than the newer ones. But my older ones are probably 3-4 years I've been using them now. And they no longer have really sharp points on them, but they still are really good for blending. I use a size 1 and a size 0 together to do 2 brush blending, and they still work really well. Look at that, I'm way off screen. I'm gonna come back, there we go, there I am. All right, so even though it's quite close to the torch, underneath his arm there, it needs to be in quite a dark shadow. So we're gonna paint all of his underarm there with our black and brown, all the way up onto this gloved hand. We wanna get that shadow in between all the fingers there, paint that whole glove. As I said, we're gonna go quite a bit darker on this particular one than we maybe normally would. I don't know, like I was saying earlier, maybe I'll switch to a new miniature for this class. Maybe I'll go back to doing Garwin, or maybe we'll get, because they now have that Frankenstein's monster style Bones figure. That could be a fun one to paint, like he's standing above a bonfire, right? Could look pretty cool. Or in the movie, what is he standing next to? They burn him in a barn or something, right? Or they try to. That could be a good OSL project. All right. So the other thing I'm doing is that anything that would cast a shadow, I'm also painting dark underneath it. So this belt pouch, the torch is going to light up the top of the belt pouch, but underneath it, it would cast quite a long shadow. So I'm actually just going to go all the way and paint most of his leg with the black and brown as a result of that shadow. Now, if I want it to be lighter later, I can come back and add some more, a lighter layer of paint on top of that. All right, I feel like that's about where I want to be. So about half of him, maybe a little bit more than I usually would do, but about half of him has been painted this black and brown color. Oh, look, that missed the back of his head. Done. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at him from our shadow direction again. We're going to line up that hand through his head, through his torch, and see if we missed anything. I have definitely missed a few little spots, but overall it's not too bad. Under his edge of his jacket there, and under his hoods, a little bit of his arm there. There we go. A little bit on his wrist.
We've got a few questions here too.
Keep going, go ahead.
Since light moves fairly linearly, should the shadows be more even edged, or does a bit of roundness do better to imply the torch is flickering?
Great thought. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to be progressively layering up, and we're going to overlap each layer to reduce the sharpness of the transitions as we go from this very dark shadow side to the light side. So yes, we are going to soften the edges of these shadows as we bring in the illumination. That's a really good question.
And then if the eventual color of the mini is something other than brown, such as the various colors on the wizard shown earlier, do you adjust the color used in this initial stage?
Yes, you can. And I've chosen the brown in this particular study because I know that with their red component, they're going to work really well with these oranges that we're going to glaze on later. And if you look at the guy in the top right corner with that torch there, that torch also has some reds on it. The Reaper like 9004 fire red, 9005 phoenix red, and then these two colors that are in that same set, they progressively work really well together as flame, right? So often what I'll do is actually, so the purpose of these colors, the glaze today, is to show you what it looks like with the glazed color. But normally I might use 3, 4, 5 colors to get progressively more red or colder, if you will, the further I get from the torch. So if I was to say if I wanted to paint a shining green light, okay, not like that yellow moth green that I had on the wizard, but something which is much more like a luminous green, then blue or teal are good colors to support those green lights. In that case, I might start with a really, really dark mixture of black and blue, or just straight black, and then progressively work my way up through various blues, getting lighter and lighter until I do my final highlights, because those blues are going to support the green. The blues will darken the green, which is what I want to have happen in the areas away from the light, but where it's mostly going to be those light colors, it's going to support the green and make the green brighter. So yeah, you use a bit of color theory to find the color that will support the color that you want to make your glow effect. So for that reason, and I've tried this experiment and been horrified by how badly it goes, I tried doing a purple glow on a yellow cloak. And it didn't work. Why? Because yellow and purple are complementary colors. They're opposites. As soon as you mix them together, you get gray. So essentially, the yellow was always going to be brighter than the purple that was supposed to be my illumination color. I can never make the purple brighter than the yellow. So choosing the right, there are ways to do it, but not with this particular approach. So yeah, choosing the right color as the foundation for what you're eventually going to do will make a big difference. And yes, I would do it with other colors. Okay, go ahead, Katie.
That was all we had for now.
Okay, right on. And I started painting more than I intended to, and I made a big mess. So I just cleaned it off. There we go, gone. All right, so the next thing I want to do is look at the miniature through the light side. I'm going to light up the torch with its head, and you can see the mess I was just referring to. I made my shadow a little too big. We're going to fix that. So I've got the light, and pretty much everything that's facing that light directly has a little bit of white paint still showing. So it's definitely going to be brighter when we're done than the brown. I definitely put a little bit more brown than I should have on there. It's all good. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move to our second color. And we're going to apply our first layer. And we're going to use the earth brown. So what I'm going to do, exactly what I did before, I'm going to take some of the earth brown, move it off to the side. I'm going to smooth it out. And now I'm going to do a quick demonstration of how to apply the layers. Remember, again, beginner class, foundation, right back to the basics to set a solid foundation for what's going to happen in the future. So let's assume this is just a blister pack from a mini primed gray. When I go to apply the layer, I want to have the earth brown overlap 50% of the brown over the black and brown and 50% of it over the white. Okay, I've just switched it over there. And what that's going to do is it's going to light up some of the shadow and it's going to darken some of the light side, but less than the black and brown did. Okay, and this is how we're going to build away from the dark shadows to our light intensity. So how do I make this work? Well, let's just pretend that this gray is our black and brown. And somewhere on this is going to be a line where that black and brown meets the white. Okay, so I'm looking at that line, and what I want to do with my layers, I'm going to thin this paint just a little bit so it's easier to see when I do this on the little card here. I want to start, say this is the white side. I'm going to put the paint in the white and then pull it towards this line, pull it towards the boundary between the black and brown and the white, just like this. Okay, now the reason I'm doing that is because when we do our brush stroke, where we first put the brush down, it puts a dab of paint. Okay, but that's still wet. So as we move the brush, we get a nice even layer of color, but where we lift it, we get more paint off the brush. So what I'm doing by doing the layering this way, by making my series of brush strokes, pulling the paint towards that boundary, is I'm making a gradient from white to a little bit of paint to a lot of paint. And this is on the boundary where the black and brown meets the white. That makes that sharp boundary disappear a little bit. And as I said before, I want to put some of that earth brown over the black and brown. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to pull away from the black and brown towards the white. So I'm going to do the opposite. This is the brown side, same brush stroke, opposite direction. And I pull towards the light. So when I put a lighter paint down, I pull it towards the light. If I put a darker paint down in a light color, I pull it towards the dark. Pull the dark towards the dark, pull the light paint towards the light. And you'll note that, like this line that I painted is almost invisible under these dots of paint. That paint's going to be, the earth brown's going to be quite dark and saturated over that boundary, making that sharp edge disappear. And then we're going to do it again with the next color over this boundary, and then again over the next boundary. And eventually there'll be no boundaries. We'll just have basically linen white on our highest highlights, like you can see on the guy in the top right photo. So let's do that now. Let's start slapping that earth brown on there. Now on mine, I went maybe a little bit too heavy on the dark shadows. So I'm going to try to push that back a little bit by moving my boundary further into the black and brown. But, you know, that's just the way it works. So I'm going to do this right in the middle of his chest to start, so we make it really obvious so you can see it. I'm going to put my brush out here. So I want about half of this on the left and half of it on the right. And I want to do about maybe a quarter of the width of the figure. But really what I'm visualizing is a ring. Okay, there's a ring kind of around this torch that we're thinking about. So I'm going to pull the paint, put the paint down in the light and pull it towards the dark because it's darker than white. Do it like that. Pulling those drops of paint onto the boundary, a little bit past the boundary. I'm going to do that further down here as well. I'm going to go right, pull it right onto those areas that I left light down there. I'm going to pull that down over this little belt pouch. I'm going to do the same thing on the back. Okay, this light patch where the light would still hit, I'm going to come down across that to the brown. And I do that up here on his shoulder. Sorry, I drifted. Up here on his shoulder as well. I'm going to pull that towards the dark. Same thing on the hood. And on his head. Pull across that boundary. And then I'm going to do it in reverse. I'm going to start in the black and brown and pull towards the light side. And that's really going to lighten up those very dark black and brown areas. Okay. Now I've also got a little boundary here on his arm. I'm going to do that in his arm as well. But it's going to be much smaller because it's a smaller diameter sort of cylinder shape. But we still apply the same technique on those boundaries. Might have to switch to a sharper brush in a minute because this brush is pretty beat up. So we pull that down across the boundary. And then we go the other way and pull it back up. There we go. Now I think that this side of his pitchfork is probably going to need to be a bit lighter than I've left it. So I'm going to just add a little layer of that along the length of the pitchfork as well. Still working with that same color, that earth brown. Put that right along the edge.
A couple people are asking about whether you're intentionally stopping at the line that you want to be the transition in order to create the pool of paint.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I'm doing, so that the saturation and the opaqueness of that color obscures the sharp line between the black and brown and the white. So I'm trying to obscure that step. So yes, we want the paint to be a little bit pooled on that boundary, just like I ended up doing right here in the middle of his chest. And in fact, that line is almost invisible already after that one layer. Now we've got another sharp line further away, and we're going to obscure that one with the next layer of paint. I need to do that on the base as well, down here at the bottom. It's a little bit more difficult though, because I've got sand on the base, but the same general idea. I'm just going to kind of dab it in for this one though. There we go. There we're at. Here we're two. Okay, so let's move on and do our next one. This is going to be a lot darker than the last one we did. That's all good. So now I'm going to move on to, what color was that? That's the leather brown. And exactly what we were just doing, smooth it out a little bit. Don't want the brush too heavily loaded. And we want this layer to be, so let's say the black and brown was half the figure. The earth brown was about a quarter of the figure. We want this layer to be about half as wide, again, as the earth brown was. It doesn't need to be very wide, but we still need to cover the transition between the earth brown and the white. I'm going to do it exactly as we did before. Pulling the darker paint from the light towards the dark, right onto the boundary, and then turn around. I'm going to go back the other way. Start in the dark and pull towards the light. And if there are raised surfaces, like these little bits of ridges in the cloth, where they're raised, they're going to catch the light further away. So I might extend the light a little bit further on some of those raised areas. It looks a little bit more natural that way. Similarly here, this little bit of cloth is raised. That's a little bit raised. Those are going to catch the light a little bit. Top of the belt pouch, same idea. That's going to catch the light quite a bit. And then we'll pull upwards onto that. Same with this belt. I'm going to start in the dark and pull that towards the light. Same thing down here. We're going to start in the dark, pull towards the light because there's a bit of a ridge in the cloth there. And I'll give that ridge a little bit of paint and then do the same thing going the other way. Just like that. Lightening him up a little bit. I think maybe a little bit of his leg here would catch just a little bit of that light. So I'm going to do a little bit pulling upwards. Not all the way to the bottom of the coat because that's going to be a bit of a shadow, but just a hint. And then we'll do it on the back side as well. Let's do it on this, this hood. Pulling from the light to the dark, reverse it, pull from the dark to the light. Hitting the raised areas a little bit more than the low areas. To do that on the side of his head as well. Do it on his arm. Right there in the crevice of that elbow, I'm going to do it as well. On his hand. There we go. A little bit more on the top of that belt pouch would make me happy. There we go. Now, let's look at this pitchfork he's got going here a little bit. So the sides of that pitchfork that's close to the torch is going to catch quite a bit of light. So that needs to be brightened up a bit. I'm just going to put kind of a line of paint along it like that. And then reverse it and do the same thing on the other side. These metallic areas are going to be quite reflective of the light. So they're going to be a bit so this area is going to be a little bit brighter, have shiny spots relative to what the skin tone or this leather might have. So there's going to be a little bit brighter as well. Orient it this way. All right, let's take a look at our handiwork here. Where have we missed that we think the light is probably going to hit? Maybe a little bit on the tips of these fingers. Maybe a little bit more on this collar. His face definitely is going to get more of the light. Probably in that crook of his elbow a bit more. And I think probably the back of this hand would get quite a bit more light than that. So we're going to lighten that one up a little bit as well. Maybe just kind of hit the tops of those fingers. Something like that. Darken up that torch a little bit too. All right. Here we go. Now, and we are starting to be able to see some of those white spots that we missed, or that I missed on my figure in the first step. You can pretty clearly see that there's one right down there and by his foot. Need to get that paint in there to hide that white spot. And there's one right in there that needs to be darkened up. There we go. Cool. All right. And probably the base could use a bit more earth brown, but that's good enough for what we're trying to achieve here. I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so now I'm going to move up to the next layer. And where I made mine quite dark, might run out of room for my additional highlights pretty soon. Well, it was a little bit of a mistake, but that's the way it goes. So I'm just going to keep going. So now in here, you can see that the transition line right there, which is at the center of my previous color. So this current color, I'm going to pull that light towards that boundary. And then do again the same from the other direction, pulling light up to obscure that boundary. I'm going to do that same thing all the way around yet again. All those areas that we just did with that previous color, we're going to take the same approach again and put the light paint in the dark, pull it to the light, put the dark paint in the light areas and pull it towards the dark. Same thing again.
We've got a question in the chat.
Yep.
Since this is an underpainting, what colors are you planning to use for his final smock and pants? Also, when you paint these final colors, do you glaze them in order to maintain your undercoat shadows?
So I haven't made any decisions about what color he's going to be in the end, because I'm not planning to finish painting him. I'm only going to go as far as the underpainting stage, and I'm going to build up a whole collection of these unpainted rioters. But same way as we had looked at with that wizard. Okay, pretty much any color scheme is going to be viable. Here's the same guy again, started from the same point, but he's been painted blue over a very similar underpaint. So you can pretty much use whatever color scheme you like. Just bearing in mind that what's underneath it is brown and what's going to go over it is orange. So in that case, something like purple, dark violet purple, might not work as well as something like leather browns, greens, some reds, things like that. Okay. Lost track of where I was. Right middle of the arm. Same thing again on his arm. Oops. And you'll notice that I'm still not being particularly careful. The main thing I'm trying to achieve is the general sense of how bright things should be in various areas. I'm not really concerned about it being really, really tight and finessed, because I know something's going to go over it. So like the, what was that thing we were just talking about? The orange color that's going to get glazed on here, that's going to dull down all of these highlights that we put on there. So I know that that's also going to make some of the transitions a little bit, appear to be a little bit smoother than they otherwise would appear. Going to put a little bit more brightness on that pitchfork. Maybe a little bit more on his torch handle there. Yeah, good enough. All right, I'm going to move up to the next color, which is amber gold. And now it's kind of hard to see where the boundary is for my my previous layers, where the boundary is, where is the line within that? What am I trying to cover? So the key thing now is with these last two colors is I'm trying to keep those highlights on raised surfaces that are going to catch the light, and keep them confined to that ring close into the torch where I want the illumination to be brighter. So as I look at this guy now, this is the center of his torch. Sorry, I've been forgetting to advance the slide as I do each step. There we go. We're about up here now. Although mine's, like I said, quite a bit darker than that guy. So the key is, here's the center of my torch, and the light is going to be brightest in a ring fairly close to that. So really the only areas that are within that ring of light are going to be like a little bit. In fact, I'll just draw the ring kind of right on there. I'll just kind of dot it in there to show where I'm thinking this ring of light is. Kind of goes across him at about that distance out from the torch. So these highlights are going to be pulling from just outside this towards the center of the torch. So they're not all going to be pulling towards that side of him. They're all pulling upwards towards the center of the torch in a concentric ring, like picture it like the rays of light are like the spokes of the wheel coming into the hub. We're also going to put some of this right on the torch adjacent to the bright spot that's going to be our light source. We want to dull down or sort of darken the areas around that so that that one white spot in the center is the brightest thing on the figure. So I'll do that first. I'll do a little bit of that up there.
And then we have a couple more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Somebody asked, how do you get the undercoat to show through the finished colored paint? Sorry, very new at this. And also, would you use like purples if you're planning an overcoat of like blue?
Purple and light blue. That could work. Yeah, that could work. Especially when you're using colors like, like nightshade purple and working your way up. That's a great color. It's like practically a black. So if you were to make a series of gradients using nightshade purple and adding like tiny little bits of, sorry, my magnifier's kind of gone wonky on me. Adding tiny little bits of linen white at a time to make a series of progressively lighter colors, that could work really well. And that could be a pretty good support for a blue, for blue painted over it, as well as for a blue light source. In terms of how am I going to get these, how am I going to get these shadows to show through what I paint above it? Well, we just got to remember that the paints that we're using are all semi-translucent. Okay, so we're not going to take the paint straight from the tube and not thin it at all or not smooth it out at all and put it right on top of that everywhere, because that'll be quite opaque. And I mean, just could, like, if you paint the whole thing black after we do this, that's going to cover everything up. But if we paint a thin layer, doesn't necessarily have to be a thinned layer, but a thin layer of kind of like a mid-range red color, like say, maybe something like, oh, here's a great one. I use this one all the time. Reaper's violet reds, right? These violet reds, if you smooth them out, they become quite translucent. So these go over these shadows really well. And particularly the pale violet red, when it's put over the bright areas on a figure like this, gets highlighted quite effectively. So they don't hide the shadows. They work well with the shadows that we're putting in place. So you do have to kind of learn your paints a little bit, learn which ones are thin, which ones have translucent or transparent pigments, like yellows tend to be quite transparent. And then when you choose your colors to paint over, don't put them on full thickness. Smooth them out or even thin them, just carefully thin them a little bit so they're not sloshing everywhere or running where you don't want them to go, but also so that they don't create lines. When you paint thin with water, when it dries, it leaves marks. And if you've gone through the effort of creating a gradient, and you can see it right here on the stuff that I painted, see those marks where that thinned bit of paint right there dried? It left a ring. So if you thin your paints with water and it kind of starts to fall apart a bit, you'll get these ring shapes where it dries. And that would kind of mark up that smooth transition that we're kind of developing right now. So you paint them thinly, use paints that are tending to be translucent, and paint them on thin. And what's underneath, it'll shock you how strong an influence this color would have underneath another color, especially when you've got something as bright as this right next to it. I mean, you can see that again. I'll show you. Has a pretty strong influence. All right.
One more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
If not water, with what would you thin the paints for this purpose?
I use water, just not very much. If you want to get into using mediums, then maybe you could use, maybe a bit of a flow aid or something like that to thin it so that the paint will kind of lie flatter and dry quicker. But these days I pretty much don't use much in the way of mediums. I just use a little bit of water, and I'm just cautious about how much water I use so that the paint doesn't start depositing those coffee rings or coffee stains or ring marks as they dry. Comes with a little bit of practice. I'm not saying don't thin your paints at all, but you want to control how much they're thinned. Okay, so again, I'm doing this bit of torch light. I'm putting a bit of this darker color on, and then I'm pulling it away from the white spot. That's going to be my light source. I'm going to do that on both sides of the happy little torch here. All right, I need to get into, where am I at now? All right, I keep building up this brighter highlight in that ring quite close to the torch. And I've got one more layer of color that's going to go on here, which is even lighter, and it's going to be even closer to the torch. Yeah, feeling pretty happy with that. I mean, it's not the most beautiful thing I've ever painted, but the general effect is there. That face looks pretty horrible, doesn't it? That's all right. I can live with it. All right, I'm moving up to my final yellow color here. This is the golden blonde. Exact same thing, smoothing it out, not too much on the brush, but I'm going to use this pretty sparingly, right? This really should be only in the areas that are closest to the light source. So I'm going to start by painting a little bit of it on the light source itself. That's where we are now. Exact same way as we've been doing all along. Turn around and do it the other way. Not way too much paint on the brush. There we go. So I'm starting to feel my ears a little bit here. I'm normally in bed by 10, and it's 9 o'clock here now. Been on the go since 5 or 6 this morning. So if I'm looking a little sloppy in my painting, that is why. And I'm going to blame that for why I keep drifting off the camera. Okay, so now I think you can see why it's important to have that white spot retained in the center of the torch, and why having the miniature zenithal highlighted is not really going to work the greatest for this approach. I'm going to do just a few little highlights on the areas closest to the torch itself. So I'm looking at, this side of this pitchfork. Since it's metal and it's reflective, maybe I'll put a little bit up on the top of this pitchfork as well. Maybe a little bit right there on the handle because it is reflective. I'm going to highlight a little bit on his face so that his features show up better, since he's a humanoid, and we want his facial features to stand out a little bit. Right on the edge of that hair, closest to the torch. His ear. Then I'm just going to do a little bit on the tops of these bits of cloth. Not too much though, just a little bit.
And then we had a couple more questions.
Okay.
Is there a handout or reference slides for each step?
There is. There's a PDF of the slides, and I haven't posted it yet, but I will do my best to remember, and I'll be posting it in the in my Discord channels. It's exactly these slides that are up here on the screen. They'll be posted in the channel. Of course, this is videoed now as well, right? So people can go back and take a look at the video and get clarification if there's anything they had questions about. I'm going to fix one thing that's kind of annoying me.
If I make a mistake and go to high on the gradient, can I go back over and do it over again, or will that ruin it?
Nope, definitely. In fact, this was what I was about to do right now. I put too much light color in there on the pitchfork. So I'm just going to go back in with my black and brown and knock it right back down again. So yes, absolutely, you can make corrections, and you should make corrections, you know, make adjustments where you think they need to be. And, you know, the more often you do this, the more often you practice this, the better you get at judging where the highlights should be, how bright they should be, where the shadows should be, how dark they should be. And it gets progressively easier the more often you do it. Somebody asked in one of the other classes about using, you know, setting up your miniature, shining a bright light on it, taking a photograph and using that as a reference for where the highlight should be. And in some ways it's a good idea, but my personal experience was that if I'm constantly looking back at that tool, at that crutch, I'm not really learning how to read the miniature directly. And so typically I don't do that. I don't have slides on my workspace. And I just adjust the position of the miniature, think about where should the light hit, where's it not going to reach, and then you'll end up making decisions that look good, even though they may not be physically, technically correct. Like light might not reach certain places, but you'll make a decision to put light there anyway, and it makes your figure look better. So my recommendation is just paint a lot, do a lot of practice right on the miniatures, and don't worry too much about trying to follow a reference exactly, because you'll get a feel for it. You'll get your own sense of what you like and how you want to do it, and then you'll start developing your own style of doing it. And you know, from where I'm coming from, that's what it's all about, is finding a way to do it that works for you, that you enjoy, and it's kind of your way of painting. I'm going to bring up a few of his facial features just a little bit more. And that's another great example of how that is technically incorrect, because I've got the highlight on the dark side of his face now, but it looks better, although his sneer is bright white. So we're going to get rid of that sneer with a little bit of really dark paint, just like that. There we go. That's better. Okay, now he looks like a proper villain. Okay, so the next step would be to do the linen white. Okay, and mine's pretty darn bright already. I don't really need to do a lot of linen white. It's relatively bright compared to how dark it is below. My dark zone is quite large. So when I start putting this linen white on, I'm going to be making very, very small highlights. On some of these earlier figures, like this one from last year, the linen white piece was 2 or 3 times as big as I'm going to make it right now. So for today's figure, it's going to be a little bit smaller. But your figure that you're working on could be a little bit different from mine, and that's all good. That's fine.
We had a few more questions. It looks like people are asking questions in the chat. I just want to remind you to please use the question and answer feature. It keeps things a bit more organized. Someone asked if a wash medium would be better for thinning paints.
No. Sorry. So what's the purpose of the wash medium? The way washes are meant to work is that the medium, the surface tension of the medium and its viscosity moves the pigment away from the spot where it's deposited and into low spots, or gravity pulls it into lower spots in the figure to create shading. So if you thin your paint with a wash medium and then apply it attempting to make a layer, you're not going to get a layer of paint. You're going to get a very thin area that's tinted a little bit, and most of the pigment is going to be moved by the medium off of that area into the low spots. So that's not going to work for you. Now there are glazing mediums, or you can add additional matte medium to your paint if you want to use mediums to do it. And that will, anything you add to the paint is going to reduce the saturation of that paint. So when you add water to your paint, you're increasing the volume of liquid, which means the density of pigment goes down. It's less saturated. So you can desaturate your paint that way, in a bunch of different ways. But the key thing is you want the pigment to stay where you want it to be. And if you can find a way to thin it down, to desaturate it, where once you apply it, it's going to stay where you want it, go for it. And if it works for you and you like it, go ahead and do it. I used to use a mixture of flow aid and glaze medium all the time. I quite like that. But now what I'm finding is it doesn't behave the way I want it to behave. And when I go to do various kinds of blending, it doesn't really work well for those kinds of blending. So what I'm finding now for me is that just using a tiny bit of water to keep the paint from drying up, and then painting it thinly, moving the pigment to where I want it to be, manipulating it with the brush, using brush control, gives me a better result than allowing a chemical to do what it wants to do to move the pigment in the way it's intended. So for me, thinning with a little bit of water works better than using the mediums. And that's why I choose to do it that way. All right, I'm almost done with the linen white. Was there anything else at the moment, Katie?
Minnie's partly out of the picture. Yeah, there's actually quite a few of them. They're building up here.
Okay, people are getting interested. Excellent.
When you apply the lighter paint onto the darker side and pull to the light, it looks like you're starting only a few millimeters on the darker paint. Is that correct?
Yes, because I'm making very small layers now. So if I was to suddenly start way out here, that's going to become far too bright at this stage. At this stage, I mean, you can look how small that linen white layer is. It's pretty darn small. So yes, I'm only crossing the boundary by just a couple of millimeters at this stage. Much earlier on, when I did that first layer of earth brown, it was a solid, half centimeter across the boundary. But now I'm making very small changes. So it's a much smaller, yeah. Next one.
Is it possible to do a zenithal based on the object location?
Yes, it is. If you, I wouldn't try it with a rattle can, but with an airbrush, absolutely. Once you get proficient with an airbrush, you can basically do most of the same things with that as you can with a regular brush. There's limitations there, but there's a lot of things you can do in the same way. And these days, when I'm, trying to do a lot of figures very quickly, that's exactly what I do. I do my my value sketch, start with black primer, apply some gray paint or primer with the airbrush, and do my brightest highlights with white ink, including doing white ink right in the center of the object, which is meant to be glowing. And in fact, well, look, here's a Sarah the Cirrus, kind of done in that way, right? The shadows all point towards that orb in her hand. And that was done with an airbrush, only takes a couple of seconds. So yes, you can do a zenithal style highlight that points towards the light source, but bear in mind, the paint does not behave towards the same as light. Paint swirls in and around things. The paint concentration is going to be different than it's going to be with the diffusion of light. So you can't just blast and expect that the paint's going to behave like light. You have to deliberately apply the highlights where they should be to match what your intent is for your light source. But yes, it can work. Next one.
Earlier, you mentioned that purple and yellow did not go well together due to the grays it forms. Would you not have the problem with the final glaze if you tried to have a purple shirt?
Yes, you might. And what sometimes will happen is you go and glaze on your light color and you've made a mistake, and it turns out that the color that you're glazing over has too much of a similar pigment content or color content as the color you're glazing. And suddenly one part of your miniature turns into orange pumpkin, and it has no impact on the adjacent piece, which you painted purple or indigo. Speaking from experience, right? I once painted a witch, Selmarina the witch, and her skin tone had too much orange in it. When I glazed the orange, her skin was pumpkin and nothing else changed color. So yes, those mistakes can happen. So that's why it's worth thinking through the color theory a little bit. In the case of that purple, what you might do is make the highlights on the purple first, maybe by adding linen white or another color, to create those lighter areas for the highlights in the purple before adding the glaze. Then the glaze is turning the highlight paint, the glaze color, not turning the purple in the shadow areas, the glaze highlight color. So a little bit of planning, choosing the right colors is going to make it easier, but not impossible. But yeah, you could go and glaze your orange color over and the purple shirt doesn't change color. It could happen. And then you go back and you think about, well, why did that happen? And you come up with a fix to the problem. Okay, as I'm answering these questions, I'm going to go to the next step. Now, the next step is a little bit more advanced. You don't have to do this if you don't want to do it. Normally at this stage, I'm waiting for all this paint to dry before I glaze the color on. We got about a half an hour left, so I want to keep moving on with that step. The questions are good, so keep the questions coming. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my black and brown, and normally I might do this with black. And you don't really have to do it at this stage, but I find it useful. And it's basically black lining. So anywhere that two surfaces meet, they make a shadow. So like where my fingers butt up against each other, there's a black line that appears, a shadow that appears between my fingers. Essentially, it's exactly what we're going to do on the miniature. We look for anywhere that two surfaces touch each other, and we're going to put a black line in where those two surfaces meet. And what that's going to do is define the shapes for us. It's going to separate shapes that are essentially right now are all kind of a uniform grading of color. The different shapes are not well defined. By doing that, it's going to help us identify, first of all, whether or not certain shapes are not dark enough or not bright enough. And it also, again, it allows a little bit more time for the glaze, the colors that we've already layered in to dry before we do the glazing. And but normally this would be a step that you would do almost right at the end of your paint job. But again, my personal experience was once I learned how to do black lining, I discovered how useful it was. But it takes time to learn how to do it. The earlier in your painting career you start doing black lining, the better you get at it, the better you get at brush control. It helps you learn how to make straight lines for freehand. So start doing black lining as early as you can. And then later when you need it for something intermediate or advanced, it'll be a tool that you have. So that's why I'm suggesting we're going to do a little bit of it today. So I'm going to do just a couple of quick ones here, and then I'll take the next question from Katie. I want to give you an example here. I'm going to work on, say, his belt here on the front, okay?
The next question. Oh, sorry.
His belt buckle butts up against the leather. So I'm going to do a line right in there between the buckle and the leather. And you might have to thin your paint a little bit to get to flow smoothly for this, just a tiny little bit of water added in. And quite often when I'm doing black lining, I do add flow aid, or use something like a wash or use a contrast paint or something like that, because they're formulated, they're designed to go into cracks and make shadows. So this would be an appropriate use for those washes and something like a contrast paint. Okay, go ahead, Katie.
Are you a part of Aaron's Cult of 40?
I wish I could be. I'm at 38 PSI because if I go right to 40, the valves start to leak on my air, my whole setup. So I'm lonely in the cult of 38. Great question. I like that question. Thank you. Next one.
That was it for now.
That was it for now. Okay, right on. So I'm just going to do a little bit of dark lining for a few more minutes until I'm pretty confident that those glazes my layers are dry. And you see how his belt buckle and those shapes are much easier to pick out now. I did a little bit on his belt pouch as well, and that showed me a spot that I couldn't see before right there that didn't get painted earlier that needs to be painted. So doing that little bit of black lining, or really I'm using the black and brown to do it, it's helping me to see the different shapes more easily and helping me refine the transitions and the shapes and things that we've got going on here. Do it between his fingers there, and do it in the fronts of his fingers. It's not just away from the light where the shadows would be. Anywhere two surfaces meet, even if that faces towards the light source like those fingers do. Same thing with this thumb. I'm going to do it on top of that thumb. Do it around there.
Another question?
Yep.
When black lining, should you attempt to do the areas between the raised folds, or is it too much contrast?
I wouldn't do it in the areas between the raised folds because they're not two different surfaces butting up against each other. but I would definitely do it under the edge of this collar where it's folded. Oh, darn, I just put my brush right into the water on the palette. Give me a sec, get back to where I was. All right, there we go. Okay, so where that, where there's a fold in the collar there, I would definitely do it there. Just like that. But not all these other folds. Because again, they're not two surfaces beating up against each other. If I was feeling particularly saucy, I would do behind his ear, like that. Where his hair is laying down on his scalp, there's the hair is a different material laying against his skin. So in this case, I'm gonna a little darker line there. I'm gonna do between his lips because these would have a shadow there. Right here in the front of his jacket where there's all these little, what would they be? They're like little hooks, I guess, to kind of attach the two sides of his cloak together. I'm gonna do it in there, back in there, bottom of that wretched pitchfork. Somebody earlier today painted was it today or yesterday, painted the version that has the big scythe in his hand. It's quite a mean looking version. The metal version is different from the bones version. What else are we gonna do here? I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes on it. I'll do a little bit on the back of his belt pouch, back of his belt, under his belt there. That thing right there, whatever that is. There. Oh, definitely where the hood meets his arm, that needs to be done, right in there. Oh, and the gauntlet, we got to do where the gauntlet meets his arm, right in there. Yeah, there we go. That'll pretty much do it for now, I think. So now you can see a lot of those shapes are a lot more clearly defined than they were a few seconds ago. All right. So now kind of the moment of truth. All right. So in the normal process that I would do, like with those wizards I was showing you, that's it, it's done, ready to go. And I would start applying my layers of color onto this and paint them almost the way I normally would. Okay. But always keeping in mind what my light direction is and what my shadows are. So if I was to paint this guy red, I would still make the effort to do highlights within the red and create shadows within the red. I'm not just going to rely solely on these shadows, but they're a good foundation start point. Okay. So then after it was painted, I would go in and glaze on the color pieces. But what we're going to do today, since this is pretty much like at that done stage, this is pretty much exactly where this guy is at. You can see a little bit of the black lining has been done there, and like even the cat's eyes have got the little bit of black lining done in there. Okay. What we're going to do is we're going to use those little bits of glazed color that we laid in the palette earlier, and I'm going to clean out this nice new Raphael and put it aside because I don't really need this brush to do this part. And I'm going to grab, the brush I used earlier today didn't work that well, but let's try a different one.
Speaking of brushes,
this flat synthetic brush. It's just a flat, what does it be, like a filbert synthetic. What size is this? Number 0. It says Kolinsky, but it's synthetic. It's a synthetic brush. Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
So someone was asking what size brush are you using and how much paint do you put on it at a time?
So normally what I was using, that was the number 0 Raphael 8404. And I try not to overload it so I don't end up jamming the paint right up into the ferrule and it dries and then it's no good anymore, or it needs to be more aggressively cleaned. Yeah, so I just try not to overload the brush. I do have a bad habit of mixing the paint with whatever brush I happen to have in my hand, which is pretty much a bad habit. But just it comes with practice, right? You just got to get a feel for what's too much and what's not enough. One rule of thumb I do use, especially with like people doing their first miniature ever, is you want the paint in the brush, not on the brush. So if you lift your brush, you know, I go grab my, what's this? This is the fire orange. I go load up my brush with it. All right, that paint is not in the brush. That paint is on the brush. So as soon as I touch that to the miniature, it's going to flood off and go wherever it wants to go. So that's no good to me. So I'll go back and I'll, just with the same paint that's already on the brush, I'm just going to work it, roll it, smooth it. So look how much paint came off of that brush. A lot. But now when I look at my brush, it still has paint on it, but the paint is in the brush. It's between the bristles. It's not sitting on the surface of the brush, which means when I go to paint with it, I'm much less at risk of a flood, and I'm also much less at risk of jamming the paint up into the ferrule. As you know, when the paint gets in the ferrule and dries, right, the brush starts like this, the paint dries, forces the bristles apart, and now you've got something you're going to dry brush with, right? So try not to overload the brush. And I also have the habit of, just move this, I'll move the camera a little bit. Every time I load my brush, not every time, but most of the time, I then go and just wick off the edge of the brush to make sure I haven't accidentally overloaded it, especially if I'm using paint which has been thinned at all, like this black and brown that I've been adding the water to. You can see on my paper towel there, I've been wiping a lot of that off before I go to the figure, just to be careful about flooding it with too much paint. So it comes with practice and experience, but you don't want to overload if you can avoid it. You can always go get more paint off your palette, but if you go to the figure and you flood, now you're fixing a lot of things. So it's a little bit of prevention, a little bit of caution to prevent something which might be a bit of heartbreak and a bit of or a lot of work to fix. I don't need any water at the moment. What I am going to do is I'm going to grab this marigold yellow and I'm going to flatten that out. And the paint separates on the palette quite a bit, particularly these oranges. I love these nice saturated fire oranges from Reaper, but they do separate very quickly on the palette. I mean, they come out of the bottle after vigorous shaking, still a bit separated. So they do take quite a bit of, you want to be careful to make sure you mix them up a bit. Otherwise, you might actually end up with two streaks of color, one which is very transparent orange and one which is very opaque, kind of yellow. So it's worth, I mean, you can see that on the palette, the color separation there. So I use these colors a lot. I really like them. These ones and the Saffron Sunset, and the other one I really like is Neon Glow. Neon Glow is, I do a lot of sci-fi figures, and Neon Glow is one of my favorites. I need just a little bit of water in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm making a glaze now of the color that's going to be the fire color. I don't want to go full thickness on this. I want to apply it in much thinner layers. And in fact, I'll show you on my little cheat card here what that's going to look like. There's my layering from earlier. So what I don't want to do is put a wash on there, a large volume of thin paint that's going to be pulled in different directions by surface tension, fall in the cracks, fill in the cracks. We want to preserve those shadows we've created. If we put bright pigment in the shadows, reverses the effect. Sometimes you want to do that, but in this case, we want to keep the shadows dark. So what I've got in my brush right now is probably still a bit too thick, but it's much thinner than what I've been using so far. And it might be close to a glaze consistency. We're going to check, and we're going to check by making a stripe of it down across what I've got going there on the palette already. That might still be a little too dark for glaze consistency, but for what we're doing here, it's going to work pretty well. So how did I get there? I took a couple of drops of that marigold yellow, smoothed them out by working them on the palette. I touched my brush to the water just enough to get a little bit of water in the brush. And then I added that, mixed that in with that smoothed out bit of paint. And you can see how on the palette, the surface tension is starting to make it draw in. That's how I know that there's water in there. That surface tension of the water is much higher, it pulls it into beads. If you get to the stage where you put the water in it and you go and check to see how much it beads up, and it beads up immediately, it's probably going to be too thin. But again, you can check it. I'm going to do a little bit with this. Grab a different brush and I'll do it with the black and brown. Much easier to see with the black and brown. So there's what it looks like normally. doesn't move too much, beads up just a little bit. Now, I throw a bunch of water in there. You can see it moving on the palette. It's slowly pulling itself into beads. I'm going to add more water. Moving like a rocket. Starts beading up really fast. More water. Beads up really quick. I'm going to add one more drop. Really moving on its own accord. Now look what happens when I brush that onto, and take the excess off, but look what happens when I glaze that onto what we've already got here.
We've got a couple more questions.
That's a pretty dark color. But what I really don't want to have happen is when I go and I place it where I want it to be, get my paint where it wants to be, it keeps moving on the figure, giving me these little splotches, because when they dry, they're going to look like that ring. That's not the solution for what we're looking for. Go ahead, Katie.
Okay, so someone's asking, what are you using in your wet palette as your center? I have paper, but didn't know to use that much water in it.
Yep, I am just using water, and I have parchment paper from the grocery store. I personally like Reynolds. The product placement for Reynolds, because it has a grid. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but it has a grid already printed on it. So it's much easier to quickly cut it into pieces. For the amount of water that's in my palette, right, you can see it looks like it's pretty much, the paper is almost like floating on the water on top of the sponge. And that is what I'm doing. You've got to have enough water in there that the palette is keeping the moisture content of your paint constant. It's not pulling moisture out of the paint to fill the vacancy in the sponge, because that giant sponge holds a lot of water, and that's going to pull water out of your paint to try to fill the spaces in it. So you need enough water that the sponge is acting as the reservoir to feed water into your paint. That's why there's so much water there. Okay, next one, Katie.
What is your practice card made of?
That is a blister pack off the front of a Reaper miniature that I airbrushed with a bit of gray primer. They've been working really great for us all day. I did them for the eyes class as well. Just a piece of blister pack, bit of plastic. Is there another one pending?
Nope, you're good for now.
Okay, so now I've got my super thin glaze of marigold yellow, and I lost my practice pack. I'm going to test it again because I've been talking a lot. I'm going to glaze that again. That is really probably too thin now, which is perfect. It means that I can do one layer. If it's not good enough, I'll do a second layer, add more color until I get where I want to be. Those guys are already done. There we go. Here's our guy that we're working on. So what I'm going to do is exactly what I was doing earlier. I'm going to put this color, which is darker than my white, into the white and then pull it away towards the dark. Pull the dark paint towards the dark. And then I'm going to reverse it. And I'm going to go about halfway into my highlights, which are darker than this glaze, and I pull it back towards the light. Exactly as what we were doing before. And in the middle there is going to be a boundary where there's going to be more saturation of this glaze color. So I'll do it on the card. It's going to look just like this. I'm going to pull that way, and then I'm going to reverse and pull the other way. And I'm going to end up with more pigment in the middle than on the edges, like it's tapered out. All right, I'm going to make more because it dried while I was talking. It really is like crazy dry in here today. I mean, this black and brown here is practically dry on the palette. All right. How are we doing? Too dark now. Touch more water. How are we doing now? There we go. We're back where we want to be. Okay. So now I'm going to start in around the torch because that's where the color saturation is going to be the highest. I'm not going to completely cover my white. I'm going to go a little bit into my white, half a millimeter, a couple of millimeters, not much, and then immediately pull away from it. Because I want to make sure I leave some of that white. The center of the light source needs to be the lightest object on the figure. And now I'm going to reverse that, and I'm going to pull away from the torch handle towards that light, the glaze that I just put on, but not going to go all the way up into the white. And now I'm going to do it on the top part of the torch. And you'll notice that I'm leaving just a small bit of white there. The smaller that bit of white is, the more intense it's going to seem as a light source. So we want to keep it quite tight and small so that it appears relatively bright. Now at a certain point, it's so small that it kind of disappears. But you can use this approach with like LEDs and things like that on like sci-fi robots. And as long as you've got that really bright white center, it still looks like it's lit. They do disappear at a certain point, but you can do it with like smaller than pupil-sized dots in the eyes of like visors and stuff like that. All right, so now I'm going to take that same paint and I'm going to apply it out in the other parts of the miniature. So I'm going to start at the base of this torch, and I'm going to work my way around in my concentric ring around the torch. And then I'm going to do another ring with the darker orange a little bit further out. This is the plan. Starting in the dark, and I'm pulling towards the light. And at this stage, because the lightest thing is in the center here, I'm not going to be pulling from the light towards the dark. Everything I'm painting over is already darker than the glaze, or I want it to be darker than the glaze. Like these white spots of linen white on the top of the shoulder, I want them to end up being darker than this white. So I'm not going to pull outwards from them. I'm always going to be pulling onto them at this stage. And as I said earlier, if we decide that the glaze is not bright enough, we can do more than one layer, or we can thicken it up a little bit. But we're not really trying to overdo it at this stage. We've only got one more stage left, and after I do that stage, I'll overdo it so you can see what overdoing it looks like as well. Always good to see. It's easier to know what right looks like when you've seen it wrong, and I've done it wrong a lot, so I can make it look wrong pretty quick. All right. It's already starting to look kind of lit up by that torch.
Couple more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
You don't seem to be cleaning your brush between dark and light paint, or are you using the same color paint on the dark and light at this point?
I'm only using, in this stage, I'm only using one color, marigold yellow. So I don't need to clean my brush unless it starts to dry out on me. I'm not changing colors at all. And I am going to change my brush before I go and use the darker orange that's on the palette. But for now, I'm only using that marigold yellow color. It's only that one color. There, I feel pretty happy with that. Not looking too bad. In fact, the camera doesn't quite know what to do with it because of the contrast between his right foot and the torch is so strong that the camera's trying to adjust the lighting level, but it can't figure it out because it's trying to decide, is that on fire or not? All right, let's do the same thing with the fire orange. I'm going to create a glaze with that. Thin it out just a bit. This is a pretty translucent color already. Just kind of needs to be smoothed out a little to make a glaze with it. Now it is a really saturated orange. Like if you apply this too thick, this is a color that it's really easy to make a mistake with. I mean, look what that one little dab did to my paper towel, right? That's just a touch of that paint, and it super orange right away. It's a very, it can be a very saturated color. So what I'm going to do with this one is the boundary between the marigold yellow and the darker areas, what I was describing before about pulling from the light towards the dark, dark towards the light, That I am now going to do with this darker orange. And I'll do it right there in the center of his chest first, so you can see how I'm doing it. So I'm going to pull away from the marigold yellow first. Then I'm going to turn around and go back the other way. There's just a little orange tint to it. Oh, I meant to do that on the torch first, but all right, I'll do it on the torch now. This is the yellow that I did before. I'm going to start about halfway down through that. And again, I'm going to pull away from what I want to be lighter. Oh, grab the wrong one. There we go. Or did I? There we go. All right, we're loaded back up. And I'm going to reverse it. I'm going to do just kind of the tips of those flames, like I was doing, painting a normal, like I'm painting a normal fire, where I want the burning gases to be cooling off as they rise, so that the color drops from yellow through orange through red, the further you get from the light source, right? And this helps a little bit with that illusion too, because when our brain sees those color variations, we instinctively know that that is fire. And we know that fire emits light, and our brain fills in the info as like, fire, hot, light. And that helps support the illusion. That's why when you see like a lot of those, like there's a Warhammer dwarf guy holding the thing in his hand, and people paint it with like a red flaming glow below it. And even though there's no fire on the base, you instinctively know there's a fire like glowing, a huge bonfire right next to him, because we instinctively, we see those colors, we know that they mean heat and light and fire. All right, I'm going to keep doing the little bit of orange glaze in the boundary between the marigold yellow and the shadows, just like I did in that little band right there. I'm going to do it on his face now.
And we've got another question.
Yep, go ahead. I'm listening.
Whoops, I muted myself by accident. Would you wait until another time or later to paint the outer layer, if you were going to paint one, to let it dry completely, or just keep going until it was done?
Well, today, with it being so dry in the studio, I could probably just keep going until it was done, because the layers of paint are drying almost immediately after I put them on. But if I had just gone through and done, what did we do? We did like 1 plus 12. So we did 13 layers of shadow colors, and now I'm doing a couple more layers of paint. If I went and did the my non-lit colors on top of this, I might be adding another 5, 6, 8 layers of paint. That's a lot of paint. So I might want to let that dry before going and glazing something over it, because you run the risk that the partially dried paint is going to get picked up in the glaze, and the glaze becomes muddy, right? But it really depends on your conditions where you're working. Like here today, I think we'd be challenged to have that kind of problem, because it's, for me right now anyway, it's so dry. But in, say you're painting in Florida right now, there could be quite a lot of humidity there. Same thing in Texas at the moment, where we just had all that snow. There's a lot of standing groundwater. When it starts to warm up again, it's going to get pretty humid pretty fast. And maybe you wouldn't have those kinds of quick drying times. Things might dry slower, and you want to be a bit more careful. Is all that to say, yes and no, and it depends on where you're working. It's one of the things about this hobby. There are very few reliable formulas. You really have to test and adjust what you're doing based on the conditions where you're working. So there we go. Some of you probably felt skeptical that we were going to get here, but here we are anyway, with our brightly lit looking torch there, and our guy with his mangled face who thinks that Frankenstein's creature is a monster. I think this guy is the troublemaker. All right, we're pretty much at the end of our block of time. So if there's any further questions, I'll take them, and then we'll start signing out. Any more pending questions there, Katie?
Nope.
Okay, then I'll just say to everybody that's hanging out there participating, it's last call for questions. And we've just got just a couple of minutes left if you have anything you need to ask. If not, I want to say again, thanks for participating. Thanks to Katie, especially. She's put up with me for 3 classes in a row, and nobody should have to do that. Now, Bren did it yesterday too, but I should give you guys a little bit of a break partway through that, because that's pretty brutal. Have to listen to my stories 3 times in a row. That's just cruel. But really appreciate your help today. That, you know, really good. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thanks to everybody who's participated in the class. It doesn't happen without you guys, or without you putting your questions in. I appreciate the questions. And again, just the thank you. If you're interested in checking out my work, best place to see it is on my Twitter feed, because it's the easiest place for me to post. Most of the stuff that I paint, I end up eventually, maybe not right away, but eventually ends up getting posted on the Twitter feed. So it's the best place to see what I'm working on currently. If you're interested in taking a class from me, go check out my website, hecatina.ca. There's a link on there for painting classes, and we do online classes, exactly this format, online classes for people all the time. I like doing that quite a lot, especially these days where it's hard to bring people into the classroom for like a beginner class or whatever. So check it out. And don't forget, if you want to post your pictures in that Discord channel, I will be happy to give feedback. I've been giving feedback to people all day today, and that has been a lot of fun. So yeah, please post all your stuff in there. I'd love to see it. And if there's no more questions, we'll say good night and thank you. Nothing pending there, Katie?
Oh, someone was asking about the code.
The code. Good, because I forgot the code. Again, there is a code. It's a secret code. I don't know if I'll give you the code. Yes, if you made it through this far, you deserve the code. The code is 77669. 77669, secret code. I'm not quite sure what it does. It might unlock a nuclear vessel or something like that. Who knows? But there's a code. And thanks again for everybody that participated. I wish you a good night, and hopefully I'll see some of you tomorrow in that tartan painting class. I'm looking forward to that. It's kind of fun for me. So thanks again, Katie. And yeah, I'm going to